All right, so I'm going to pick up now on panic disorder. And panic disorder is partly, if you remember, a kind of interesting sequela of having panic attacks. And there are lots of things that can cause people to have panic attacks. If you're obsessive compulsive and you're not allowed to do things that part of your obsessive compulsive, like in the grocery store when they hand me dollar bills and they're all jumbled up front and back and upside down. And I have this need to put them in order and in a particular denomination sequencing, and the people behind me are acting impatient. I can get pretty conflicted about which is more important, satisfying the people behind me or getting my money in the proper way in my wallet. Guess which one wins? So panic disorder, however, is not about that sense of panic that can occur when you can't do something in OCD that's part of the compulsive behaviors. It's more about the 13 symptoms that we talked about, where things suddenly, out of the blue, begin to create this intense panic. And then of the possible 13 symptoms, you have enough to really indicate that you've got a panic disorder, because that's then determined by frequency. And I'm going to talk about that. This is a little thorny because the DSM used to be very specific in terms of time. That's come out. But now the question is how many are just occasional panic disorders and how many create a disorder level? And that's an interesting issue. What you're looking for, and this is one of the pattern disorders, is a pattern of constant, intense, intermittent feelings. That is, it constantly happens. They're intense, but it's not all the time, every day, like in generalized anxiety disorder. It's when it happens, you know it's going to happen again, and it does happen again. So they're intermittent in that sense. It also goes into remission. But most importantly, there's this intense feeling of extreme anxiety. And that's the hallmark of this disorder, without any known reason or provocation for it. So it's really about whether you experience it out of the blue. It's not focused on a specific fear, and that's differential for a specific phobic disorder, which we'll talk about. And so the person who experiences these intermittent but intense and relatively constant experiences of intense fear begin to anticipate them. And the more you begin to anticipate them, the truth is, the more likely you're going to experience one of these. And so this intense fear and this out of the blue begins to create a pattern, and that's what you're looking for. So then you begin to associate certain things that you were doing when it happened. So it's about anticipated catastrophes. That is, you had one on a staircase, and then you begin to anticipate that you're going to be on a staircase and it's going to collapse. Around health outcomes, which is pretty common, it certainly can be triggered by people traveling. A lot of people who fly a lot, like me, will occasionally be on a plane where somebody, just as they're about to close the door, bolts, and often with the family in tow and very upset. And changes can also can often precipitate the occurrence of panic disorders, of panic attacks at disordered level. So there's a difference between panic attacks, PAs, and panic disorders, PD. What we know is that lifetime for panic attacks, and most of us at some point or other have had one, but most of us don't even think about it very much, is around 13.2%. That is, a very low percentage of people actually have a panic attack that they remember. The only one that I remember exquisitely was I was in a play when I was 9 years old. I loved rehearsals. I loved all the parts of it. But when I was actually on stage, I didn't have a speaking role. I held the staff. And I looked out and saw everybody out there. I wet my pants. And then I had a panic attack because I wet my pants. It is not uncommon for kids, particularly the first time they experience a kind of public experience like that, to have a panic attack. The only reason I remember it is I was trying to think of a good example of it where people would have a panic attack and not remember it. And I finally came up with that one, which as far as I know is the only one I've had. The majority of recurrent panic attacks, here's where it gets thorny, is around 65% of the time. That is, the majority of people who have had one panic attack have another panic attack and another panic attack. But they may not have them for years in between. About 66% of people who have had one have had another. So now it's beginning to look really common, and that's a fact. The truth is panic attacks are part of the way we manage the kind of anticipatory dangers, and we manage explosions of our own anxiety, often around meaningless things. So the lack of frequency and time frame in the DSM-4TR for panic disorder was somewhat of a problem. And so in the DSM-5, they basically indicate of that 66.5% of people who have had multiple panic attacks, somewhere around 12.8% have it at disorder level. That is frequently enough that it is in and of itself disordering or causing distress or having an impairment on their ways of functioning. Because remember, disorder level is about activities of daily living. So if it begins to kind of impinge on your ability to function at home, socially, and at work, then you're beginning to look at something that's at disordered level. The prevalence rate cross-nationally, this is out of the comorbidity studies, is around 1.7%. And then I found this really delicious study by De Jong, and I'm beginning to really like this author. I'm going to cover another study of De Jong's around dissociative that I found particularly interesting. But the cross-national lifetime prevalence estimates were around 1.7 for for the panic disorder with a median age of onset somewhere around 32. The DSM has it lower than that at 24, but De Jong and others are really looking at this starts emerging in the 30s. My own experience has been that I think the DSM may be right. I think it tends to occur in the 20s. Particularly what I've seen is at the beginning career period or the end of college period, it seems to be fairly common. The study that De Jong did, however, has a huge N. It had 147,000 people in it. And so the 32 may represent, and the thing that's good about that study was it was not only cross-national, but it was also economically diverse. That is, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic level and the higher end. So it's important to understand that this is one of those disorders that we don't really have a good handle on what the distribution is, what the frequency, what the prevalence rate is. I suspect that when we start sorting it out, De Jong is going to be a player in this, because this study in 2016, if you work with this population, is worth looking at. And this difference between recurring panic attacks and panic disorder, in my mind, is simply a measure by which the person then becomes compromised. That is, activities of daily living become so effective that the person is now at disordered level. Much like separation anxiety disorder and the rest of them, it can easily be triggered by changing life events. And it particularly seems to start increasing between 18 and 40. And if you think about it, those are high stress years. That's the years where people are launching out of their parents' home. It's where they begin working independently. It's where they start marrying and having kids. It's where they start incurring their own financial debt at higher level than just their student loans. And so as you look at this age span from 18 to 40, and you think about depression, it's also fairly high at this point. Main triggers seem to be leaving home, moving, marriage and divorce, particularly divorce, and occupational changes. That is, going from working at McDonald's to suddenly finding yourself in a work environment that has something to do with what you hope to do for a career. What seems to underlie it when you talk to people is this sense of inadequacy, or that, you know, as one person I knew who treated it, he said he always felt like he was going to be found out as not really being sufficiently trained or knowledgeable to do his job, which was actually pretty interesting because the guy was a pretty high-level management person by the time he was in his 30s. His own sense of inadequacy drove his kind of tendency towards panic disorders. And once we got a handle on the fact that he didn't have to measure himself against an ideal, he needed to measure himself against the tasks and the demands of the job, his panic started coming down. They have very high rates of comorbidity, most commonly with depression. And as I said, if you remember the kind of scale that we had around depression, it's highest in the 18 to 25-year-olds, then a little lower in the next group, and then it starts to peter out in the 50s. It also tends to be co-current with PTSD. And that's hard because you have to decide whether the person has it independent of PTSD triggers or whether they're connected to the PTSDs. And the best thing to think about is what came first. If PTSD came first, then there is a pretty good possibility it's connected to the PTSD. You'd have to do a little more assessing to be sure of that. If it precedes the PTSD, then obviously they're two separate diagnoses. And also some phobias, but not a lot, because phobic disorder is more common. Please notice the absence of generalized anxiety disorder. And when we get to generalized, that's an ongoing, continuous discharge of anxiety, not necessarily at the levels of panic, but at the level where there's opportunistic worry that is compromising. It's very hard to do that continuously and then have this sudden escalation of anxiety, fight-flight syndrome. And so they tend not so much to be mutually exclusive, but quite rare. They also can have some pretty important medical connections. Anybody who starts showing this pattern needs to have a cardiac assessment, because a mitral valve prolapse in particular, which can cause the heart to flutter, is one of the things that creates this sense of smothering and heart up in your throat. That's one of the symptoms that goes along with panic attacks. So if somebody's had this and they haven't had a cardiac assessment, they probably ought to have a cardiac assessment. It also is fairly common with hyperthyroidism. Irregular heartbeats, tachycardia, bradycardia are both racing heartbeat and very slow heartbeat can cause the same thing. It also tends to be common in people with very high systolic, that is the upper number, blood pressure. So as you can see, at least 3 of these, tachycardia, MVP, and increased systolic, are all worthy of a cardiac evaluation. So if you get a client in with this and they haven't had one, you might suggest that they go get one. As I said, the age of onset, Dijon puts it at 32, the DSM puts it around 24. It tends to climb through adolescence. That is, they have more events of this, they get closer together. They decrease in middle age, usually by the late 30s, early 40s. You see a downslope on this, and that's independent of treatment. And it's actually pretty low, if not outright rare, in those over 60. So it's continuous severe episodes is the pattern, clusters, that's why it's intermittent. You'll have a bunch of them, and then you'll have a remission, and then you'll have a bunch of them, and then you'll have a remission. And the person in remission often doesn't expect to have a remission, so they're always anticipating the next one. And they often identify places where the last one occurred and then avoid that place, which is why you get agoraphobia. And you'll see Steve talk about this. Steve talks about how he originally thought, which is very common, that it was a cardiac event, which is why you get the cardiac workup. Then he began to fear things, and this clustering, this anxiety of clustering around places where it happened and generalizing from that is very common. There are familial patterns, that is 4 to 7 times more likely if a first-degree relative has it, but also 50 to 70% of people don't have any family histories of panic attacks, though there might be other anxiety disorders. So the two look fairly close. The ICD-10 says it's acute, unexpected, recurrent episodes of persistent concerns about more attack. Intensity, an intense anxiety with unreasoning fear, terror, and a sense of impending doom, and 13 symptoms. The DSM just says recurrent panic attacks, intense fear, discomfort with the 13 symptoms. The attack has been followed by 1 month or more of worry about additional attacks, behavior changes to prevent another attack. And the ICD says, like the DSM, it requires multiple unexpected attacks. They generally last less than 15 minutes. And this is an important thing to remind people. I used to use a metronome with clients with panic attacks, panic disorder, because what I'd make them do is not only focus on the metronome and to regulate their breathing 4 beats in, 4 beats out, which slowed down some of the symptoms, but it also was a way of remembering that the intensity of the feeling is transient. The panic disorder may or may not be accompanied with agoraphobia. It may or may not, but it's more common for it to be so. So we talked a little bit, and I'm not going to make you go through the paresthesia again, although I suggest you do it so you can remember what it feels like. But the 13 symptoms, and people generally have more of these than less, is a sense of their heart beating, which of course is why tachycardia is one of the things you want to rule out as a cardiac symptom. Sweating, trembling and shaking, sensation of shortness of breath and smothering, feeling of choking, chest pains, again, you can see this pattern of cardiac symptoms, nausea and abdominal pains, lightheaded and faint, unsteady, and dizzy. By the way, that's often triggered by the hyperventilation. If you hyperventilate for a minute, you're going to have lightheaded, a faint feeling, and unsteady, which is one of the reasons that people with this disorder often carry a paper bag, so they can breathe in and out of the paper bag, small one, lunch size, preferably not wax, because it's harder to get air into that, so that they can begin to increase the carbon dioxide and decrease the oxygen. They get chills and heat sensation, paresthesia, which is a numb, tingling feeling, particularly in their extremities. The sense of derealization is really an important one. It's not depersonalization. It's not that you don't feel real, but it's the experience of where you are and what's happening has a kind of unreal feel to it. Most people feel like they're losing control. Steve talks about it. It's common. There's this feeling of going crazy. And obviously, underlying this is that fight, flight, fear of dying. So in a differential diagnosis, you've got to rule out the medical stuff. Medical stuff is really, people can have all of those symptoms because they have cardiac disease. Substance-induced panic is very common, and people do not tend to be honest about what drugs they were taking. So you really need to be clear with them that you can't understand the problem if you don't know what they've ingested. And that includes both listed and illicit drugs. You want to rule out a panic that results as because you have obsessive-compulsive disorder and you can't engage in the compulsion. It's not often that the obsessions, the thoughts cause the problem. The problems are caused by the inability to basically do what compulsion requires you to do in order to stay safe. With generalized anxiety disorder, it's pretty rare. They have continuous anxiety without acute exacerbation of it. Now, occasionally, they will have an intense anxiety attack on top of it. It's like a double depression, but it's a double anxiety. It's very rare. PTSD, people have panic attacks. They often have panic attacks in the presence of triggers for what reminds them of whatever the trauma experience was, and also as a result of hypervigilance. So you really need to understand whether there's a trauma history that's sufficient to be associated with having a panic as a result of it. And finally, phobias, that is specific phobias or social, are likely to have panic attack. It's not the same as a panic disorder. So the disorder is really about these out of the blue, incredibly intense cluster experiences of intense fear and impending doom at exaggerated levels that have more rather than less of the 13 symptoms that tend to resolve to a state of kind of anxiety about another attack, and also another attack, particularly in a situation that originally triggered an attack. So if you were on a bridge when it happened, you don't want to be on bridges anymore. Steve talks about how he didn't used to be afraid of heights, but now he's afraid of heights. There are some things that we know are helpful. He talks about the fact that the more physically active he is, the fewer of these that he has. But keep in mind, these folks often have co-occurring major depressive disorder. When you're like Barbara and severely depressed, it's hard to get off the couch. So one of the things you want to do with this population is begin to use a kind of very structured exercise routine as part of therapy, so they begin to have an ability to do some kind of self-de-escalation, safe spaces, a number of different things are pretty effective with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Steve, who you see on the film, and then you'll watch the film. So he had a very typical first episode. He's driving along, and suddenly his heart is racing, and he feels this rapid increase of anxiety. He describes a knot in his chest, and that's often as a result of tachycardia, where the heart speeds up. He describes it as out of the blue, which is one of the reasons people show up in the emergency room first, where they have symptoms that are inconsistent with cardiac, although they're often monitored for it. He had this pervasive feeling of afraid, and he says, oh yeah, I was afraid. He doesn't know what's happening, this sense of it being out of control, not understanding what's happening, and very often people feel like they're dying. And this feeling of dying is terrifying. So, I mean, we sort of act like this isn't a serious condition, but the fear level is pretty high on this. And these people often genuinely, deeply feel like they're dying. It began with medical evaluation. This is absolutely appropriate. He describes about having one of these even while he's on a treadmill, which I found particularly interesting. So then he started having recurring attacks, which is also very common. And then he started having them in multiple settings, including when he was asleep. He'd wake up with these. So he began to fear having an additional attack. And this is one of the hallmarks between a panic attack, you have an attack, and panic disorder. It begins to control your life, and you begin to fear about having another attack. He was particularly afraid he might pass out. And because of the hyperventilation, lightheadedness, dizziness is actually a pretty realistic concern. As a result, it changes the activities of daily living he engages in. He begins to restrict his behaviors. That's a hallmark of moving from attacks to disorder. And he develops agoraphobia. That is, being in places that he's not familiar because they might trigger an attack. At one point, he was having multiple attacks during the day. As not surprising, given the impairment on here, he began to develop some symptoms of major depressive disorder at clinical level, which is very common. And finally, for De Jong, his onset in the 30s is common for the DSM. It's a little late for both the ICD. So with that in mind, when you look at the film, Steve meets criteria for panic disorder. multiple attacks out of the blue, many of the 13 symptoms. He has agoraphobia. He begins to fear having them in places where he had previously had them, but he also begins to fear unknown, unusual places because he might have one. He has, in the DSM and the ICD, he would have a panic disorder. And in the ICD, it would be agoraphobia with panic. DSM would be both the panic disorder and agoraphobia. Again, we know he had a cardiac workup, but we don't know whether they ruled out MVP. Mitral valve prolapse can be very much contributed to this. And you'd want to rule out whether he is currently depressed, because we don't know that. So take a look at Steve, and then we'll move on to the other disorders.